Hello, everyone, and welcome to Brown Bag History. Today we'll be discussing the documentary, A Brief History of Women in Bars, A Minnesota Story in 3 Rounds. I'm Lori Williamson. I'm the outreach coordinator for the collections and library departments at the Minnesota Historical Society. And we are going to be speaking with Katie Thornton today. But before I introduce her, we're just going to go through some housekeeping things, which I know is always a joy. So just so we're all on the same page, staff are monitoring our conversation today and the chat to look for questions. So ask them as they occur to you. We'll put them all together and then deal with that at the end. But please send them anytime. A recording of this conversation will be available both on Facebook, on the Minnesota Historical Society's page, and on YouTube. And at the end of today's program, we will be asking for your feedback because we're really interested in kind of how people are using these programs, what they find interesting, and how it's working for you. So if you could do a really quick survey, link will be in the comments at the end. So thank you for that. One last housekeeping thing is the land acknowledgement. While we are not in the History Center today, we are in Minnesota, which is in the Dakota homeland. There are lots of other tribes and peoples who have lived here over time. And we do want to acknowledge the indigenous ancestors of the place. So thank you very much. And so now to get to other things. So I'm very excited to introduce Katie Thornton here. She is a Fulbright National Geographic digital storyteller, which I love that title, but it's kind of a mouthful. But
it's a mouthful.
It's so cool. And she's also a Gale Library Fellow. That's the name for the Minnesota Historical Society Library, a historian and a podcaster. And she is she's the person behind the research, writing, and creation of A Brief History of Women in Bars, Minnesota Story in 3 Rounds, which I could not love that title anymore, by the way. I hope you've had a chance to listen to the podcast and have specific questions about it. And if you haven't, please do after this, and that link will be available too. It's a fascinating program. It's 45 minutes, and it's a lot of fun, in addition to some really great history. So 2 more things. Katie is going to give us a brief overview of her work. Then the 2 of us will be in conversation kind of both about her work and also using the Minnesota Historical Library for research. And then we'll open the floor to your questions. And my goals for today are twofold. 1, to learn more about the intersection of temperance and the suffrage movement and the people who were left out of that main narrative. And 2, for everyone to learn more about the research process and resources available at the Historical Society Library. So, hi, Katie. Now I'll finally let you talk. I'm sorry about that.
Hello, Lori. No, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thanks for having me here for this. I mean, this was such an amazing project to work on, and to do it with the support of the Historical Society is a blessing. And thanks everybody for coming today as well.
Yeah. So let's tell me about your podcast. Kind of just let's get started kind of with the overview of what was your thesis? What were you setting out to talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I didn't set out to do a project that was mostly focusing on women in the alcohol industry. I had planned to look at alcohol kind of largely in the context of the temperance movement, the anti-alcohol movement. Sure. And my plan was to do more of a documentary that was about suffrage. And here's why those things connect. So I went into my project knowing that temperance, before suffrage, was one of the first political issues where it was socially acceptable for women to be involved. Mm-hmm. And this was largely because temperance was largely seen as a women's issue at the time. So in the mid 1800s, a lot of people would drink. Women would drink as well, but alcoholism was especially rampant among men. The average American consumed the equivalent of 90 bottles of vodka a year, and that includes like absolute abstainers, teetotalers. And it was women as well, but it was a lot of men. A lot of times it was only men who were working outside of the household. Mm-hmm. A lot of women, if they were working outside of the home, were not entitled to their own wages. And so families would often be going broke while the husband would be out at the saloon drinking. And so a lot of women got involved in the temperance movement. Mm-hmm. And through their involvement with that political movement, a lot of them came to advocate for suffrage, for the right to vote as well. And a lot of these women in the mainstream movement were framing this as, we need the vote in order to advocate for prohibition. So I knew that those 2 movements were interconnected going into it. And I also knew that the mainstream suffrage movement and the mainstream temperance movement were not necessarily holistically progressive. Mm-hmm. If you heard in the documentary, there were suffrage and temperance leaders who were using very explicitly anti-racist, anti-Indigenous, anti-immigrant language to advance their movements. And I knew that those mainstream movements were largely made up of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant women, usually wealthy. And even though both of these movements had membership that was quite diverse, the mainstream movements were really made up of these WASP women. So I had anticipated doing a project about the interconnectedness of suffrage and temperance, and also about kind of the limitations of those mainstream movements, how they were failing to engage women who were not wealthy WASPs. So what I didn't expect was to do a project that was largely about alcohol, largely about women in bars. But as I went, I know, as it goes. So as I went with the research, I kind of find that out in my early imaginings of the project, I was starting to veer down this path that I think a lot of historians and storytellers, especially a lot of historians with relative privilege like myself, can go down. There's this narrative that there's a certain group of women or a certain group of historical actors who were empowered, who were empowering themselves through their political involvements and their political organizing. And then there were other women who were not empowered or not empowering themselves. Yeah. But of course, as I did the research, it is unsurprisingly not that simple. And I was really struck by how much power women were creating and claiming within the alcohol industry. It might not have looked like traditional political empowerment, like through something like organizing for the vote, but a lot of women found greater independence, including independence from men, by working within the alcohol industry. And that is empowerment as well. And so I wanted to be sure that I told the stories of how women claimed powers in all sorts of different ways, including non-traditional ways.
I think that's so important and telling, really, because I think, you know, when you're younger and you just first learn about suffrage, and even the intersection of suffrage and temperance, sometimes you think, oh, well, there are these women who just wanted liberty and freedom, have the same rights, and so they marched for it and they got it, and right. And all the other women were just waiting around for it to happen. And you know, as you get older and you read more, you learn that that's not the case. But then to hear stories like the ones you tell, it's really not the case, because it's not just like the women were also empowered in a different way, but they were like actively, you know, on the other side of the issue, and necessarily sometimes. So could you start telling us about the kind of first vignette, the first round, shall we say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the documentary is in three parts, and the first section of the documentary does kind of tell the stories of the women who were claiming this traditional sort of political, or what has come to be seen as traditional sort of political empowerment. So in that first section of the documentary, it starts with one of my interviewees is, we're looking at an image. I don't know if we can bring that up, but there's an image of a saloon. So this is Anoka, Minnesota in 1873. And the first section of the story focuses on the women who are down on the ground here, down on this ground level, these women who are protesting outside of this saloon. What you see also is a woman up on the second floor, and she's about to dump some water on these women. She is presumably the saloon owner's wife, and does not like these women protesting and trying to shut down essentially her livelihood. But I wanted to focus, at least in the first round, on these women who were on the ground, the women who were doing the protesting. They were arguing against alcohol. Ultimately, a lot of these women went on to support and organize for the right to vote, for suffrage. And as I said before, a lot of women came to suffrage organizing through their temperance work. Mm-hmm. And their argument, as you said, or kind of contrary to as you said, as you implied with what you learn when it gets more complicated, the argument was not necessarily that women should have the right to vote because they deserve equal rights. For example, the argument was that women needed the vote in order to protect the home. And the temperance narrative fit right into this. Mm-hmm. So alcohol was seen as a sort of poison that was tearing apart the very sort of heteronormative and implicitly white family structure. And so the women in these kind of early mainstream movements would often say, we need the vote, not for equal rights, but we need the vote in order to advocate against alcohol. We need the vote in order to stay in the realm of the home. They literally called their movement home protection. Yep. And so certainly
we have things in the library as well that are about like why women should be able to vote to protect the children and to make schools better and all that kind of stuff. So it's really interconnected.
Yeah, and women for many, many years in Minnesota could only vote for the school board, and Minnesota did not ratify. We weren't necessarily on the bleeding edge of suffrage, or we had a lot of catch up to do. And certainly there were some women who were advocating explicitly, we need the right to vote because we deserve equal rights. But that was comparatively few and relatively late in the game. And so I was kind of focusing on women who were also advocating overwhelmingly for temperance. And because their model was, or their goal was sort of to protect the home, that implicitly means from these women who are doing this organizing, that is implicitly meaning kind of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant heteronormative home. And so a lot of these women, as you heard in the documentary, were using very explicitly racist, anti-Indigenous, anti-immigrant, often anti-working class narratives. And so what I wanted to do in this first part of the story is try to understand where those women were coming from. What was at risk for them, which was often legitimately their own safety. But I also wanted to look at how those women, local and national leaders, would often sort of be willing to or very actively embrace the racism and the xenophobia of the day in order to advance their own empowerment. So even when this was at the expense of other women, and they'd use these explicitly racist arguments. And this was the case, you can hear in the documentary, from very early on when alcohol was first introduced on the frontier, really as a tool of colonization and of genocide. And this kind of racist, often classist arguments continue to build and build within the temperance movement, and often within the suffrage movement as well, until they really come to a head at the World War I era. And it was in World War I that the xenophobic arguments of the temperance movement really are what pushed it over the finish line. A lot of temperance advocates basically they were using very anti-German rhetoric. They associated, say if you go to the saloon, if you drink a beer, you're supporting the Kaiser, is what one of my interviewees said. And you really do see this in the propaganda of the day. And, I'd like to say that it was in spite of their anti-immigrant sentiments and racist sentiments. But I think in many cases it was because of those sentiments that they were able to sort of empower themselves and be sort of politically expedient in a way that prioritized their own empowerment over solidarity with women across class and race.
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating about it. Unpacking all of that, because it's a low-lying thing, but it's not really. Once you start to look at it, you notice it everywhere. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
wow,
absolutely.
Well, so where do we move after that? Can you tell me about the next story?
Yeah, sure. So the first story kind of brings us in this large swath of history. It brings us from the 1800s, from the frontier period, up until the Prohibition goes into effect 100 years ago this year, 1920. Also, when the 19th Amendment went into effect as well. So the second story, it's 100 years is a lot of time, and things are still very politically hectic. Yeah. But so the second part of the story follows a little bit of a shorter trajectory, but it does still look at the pre-Prohibition period. So in this story, I wanted to look a little bit more explicitly at the women who were empowering themselves through alcohol. Somebody who might have been like in the pouring role in that initial image, dumping water onto the protesters down below. And so I took the story of a woman named Rosa Clinton, and she co-owned a bar downtown Minneapolis before Prohibition. And I learned about her bar. This is 6th Street. So this was the edge of what was called a liquor patrol limits before Prohibition. There was a very clear boundary of where you could sell alcohol within Minneapolis. It was largely downtown, a little bit spilling into near North and Northeast and the West Bank. But this was the cutoff in Minneapolis, and Rosa Clinton had a bar right on 6th Street, on the side of the street that you see has like the beer murals on the side of the buildings, rather than the side with the fancy hotel and the fancy watch store and things like this. I first learned about Rosa Clinton's bar, Cline and Ponce, through a new book that the Minnesota Historical Society Press put out called Closing Time by Andy Sturdivant and Bill Lindicke. Great book. Amazing research, and I got to interview Andy Sturdivant for this project. But I was really interested in Rosa because to me, she embodied a lot of the women who were empowering themselves through alcohol. She was an immigrant woman. She ran this bar downtown. And what I think is really important to bring in here, and what plays a pretty big role in the second part of the story, is that her bar was a hub also for union organizing. So a lot of bars served as gathering places for workers, and in an informal and often in a formal capacity as well. Klein and Ponce was probably the most common bar to hold your union meetings at. They had a meeting room in the back. And as I was researching this section, it really became clear to me how much working class power was building within the alcohol industry. Certainly, there were exploitative bosses as well, but bars were a hub for organizing, and a lot of the kind of working class empowerment also extended to women who were working in the industry. So in this part of the documentary, I also mentioned that there's a group of women in 1903 who worked at a Minneapolis beer bottling plant, and they led a wildcat strike in 1903 for better pay, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And I think it's really telling as I tease out the story of this particular bar where this union organizing was happening, and the woman who co-owned it with her husband and I believe her husband's brother. You really saw that in addition to the racism and anti-immigrant sentiment that was kind of crucial to the founding of the temperance movement, there really developed an anti-working class argument as well. So drinking was actually significantly down from the 1830s when it peaked at those 90 bottles a year per person. And yet the movement only got more strict. So at that time, people were advocating for temperance. They were advocating for moderation and self-control. But as the movement went on, they were arguing completely for prohibition. And to me, with the stories that I was reading from the other side of this movement, from the people in the alcohol industry, it seemed to me that a major part of that were the fact that men and women like Rosa Klein, who were often immigrants, often working class people, were building collective power in the space of the bars and in the alcohol industry. So the second story brings us up through Prohibition, which is when all the bars shut down, at least legally. And for Rosa, her story actually ended shortly before Prohibition. Her bar and a lot of the other immigrant-run bars that were on 6th Street downtown fell victim to a lot of the anti-working class, anti-immigrant language of the kind of late 19-teens, and they closed down even before federal prohibition would have forced them to.
That's so sad. I think of what a vibrant, interesting, crazy place that must have been, though. You know what I mean? With all the different, people owning bars and union organizing and stuff like that. It kind of sounds like a blast.
It does. And in truth, it was absolutely a blast to people at the time as well. Like there was always newspaper articles about what was going on within this district. What I think is most striking, and I believe this made its way into the documentary, it was much longer originally because there's so much to say, but I believe this made the final version, that women would go, some of these more traditional temperance movement leaders, they would go into bars and crusade. They would sing songs and pray very loudly, but oftentimes they would kind of go in disguise and hang out for a few minutes and just kind of take it all in, kind of look around, and then they would say these prayers. And to me, it's just like, there was absolutely a curiosity there.
I'm going to wreck this really great thing that I want to check out first. Oh, that's so American. I love it. Also, I just want to pause here because we're going to talk about the research stuff in a minute, but I just want to pause and point out that old newspapers are the greatest. They're just such a great resource, and we'll get back to them eventually.
Yes.
Yeah. Also, something I think I remember about this section in the documentary about, I think it was called dry bars maybe, where they didn't have chairs as a way to so people had to come, get, and go.
Yeah, so long before Prohibition, there were a lot of initiatives, like at local levels, county levels. A lot of laws were passed to discourage drinking. And one of my absolute favorite ones was that in some counties, furniture was not allowed in saloons because they didn't want to encourage people hanging out. So they had to stand up at the bar with, spit down on the spittoons.
See, that's amazing to me because I have long wondered that when I see pictures of bars with no furniture, I'm like, what? But anyway, okay. So thank you for that. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to the third. We'll talk about all this more later, but let's go on to the third section though, because that's also riveting.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, to me as well, absolutely, as a researcher, and thank you to the Historical Society's oral history collection. The third part of the story is from the Prohibition period, after alcohol was made illegal, but I wanted to figure out how women were still empowering themselves via alcohol, even during Prohibition. There are so many good stories from this era. It's like a historian's dream, almost. All of the sort of cliches of the Prohibition era, usually some iteration of them are true. You can really start to bring stories to life by, in audio, I can look at an image of a bar and start to describe it. I mean, it's so vivid from that period. So there were so many different stories from this era. Some of the ones that I was that were contenders in terms of who I wanted to feature for this section. There were a lot of women who were homebrewers before Prohibition. So before Prohibition, homebrewing was very common, but like all of the other cooking and housework, it was done by women. And so a lot of women had the homebrewing skills, and when Prohibition came, it became a very lucrative industry. There were two young women, I believe 13 and 15, who were arrested for operating a large moonshine still, and the newspaper referred to them as armed flapper moonshiners, which I just thought was lovely. And the picture of them is kind of unreal. That's in the digitized newspapers as well. And another story that was kind of a contender was that one of my interviewees, author Doug Hoverson, informed me that there was a brewery down in Rochester that seemed especially poised to perhaps outlast the dry years. A lot of breweries were switching to near beer, a non-alcoholic alternative, and they seemed like they might survive it, but they actually closed 2 years into Prohibition. And the reason that the owner of the brewery gave was he said that the women of the Rochester area were making too good of homebrew, and it was making his product irrelevant, and nobody was purchasing it. So I thought that was just a lovely assertion to make when your business is failing. So pretty precious. But ultimately, I chose to focus on a woman named Nettie Hayes, or Nettie Hayes Sherman. She ran an underground club in downtown St. Paul during Prohibition. And if you heard the documentary, you heard part of her oral history. In it, she remembers serving State Supreme Court Justice Pierce Butler and Hubert Humphrey. But it wasn't her only job. She also worked at WCCO Radio. She was one of the first Black women to work there. And she also moonlit as a pianist and a singer. So she's just really remarkable. And I chose to focus on her, not just because she is so remarkable and so accomplished, but also because there's this fantastic oral history with her at the Minnesota Historical Society's libraries. And in that oral history, this is kind of what got me when I was first doing the research. In that oral history, she lists 3 of the most important things to her. And the first thing she lists is the right to vote. And I thought that was really beautiful and poignant in the context of this broader project, because I thought about those early suffrage advocates who were also temperance advocates, and how many of them would deploy racist, classist arguments. Now they probably would not have been eager to engage with phenomenal women like Nettie Hayes. She was a woman who ran an illegal club that sold illegal alcohol. She was a Black woman who defied a lot of norms of the family structure. She had been widowed 4 times by the time she was in her 60s. And so as an older woman, single woman, she adopted 2 white children. And she was just remarkable. But I wanted to include her in the story because women like Nettie, of course, did not need the blessing of those mainstream advocates to want to pursue the same rights that they ultimately were pursuing in a different time. And I wanted to share how women like Nettie drew on the strength and the skills and the opportunities that they uniquely had to empower themselves, and ultimately to love and appreciate the vote as one very important aspect of empowerment.
I love that. Well, and that's so well in with our conversation today is part of the Votes for Women exhibit project that is online now and will be in person in the coming months. So that's fantastic. She sounds like such an interesting person. Like, how can you do everything? I'm amazed by people like that, because
I know.
Like, I have a radio thing and a speaking thing.
Right, and then I also have these gigs at these other clubs. And Kurt Brown from the Star Tribune did a feature on Nettie after this piece came out, and he dug a little bit more into that oral history, and so that's available through the Star Tribune as well. She's remarkable.
Great. Well, thank you for giving us that overview. And so now I'm going to ask you a few questions, and hopefully while we do that, people will come up in the audience with some questions and send them in the comments, and then we'll get to those after that. So, well, thank you so much. And like, I love the project. I love your storytelling. I love the way that everything comes together, and it comes, you know, I don't want to use the tired trope of coming alive, but you know what I mean? Like but it's just, you make it so real. And so I really appreciate that. How did you get the idea in the very beginning that this is what you wanted to focus on? I mean, did it have to do with the upcoming election? Was it just something that you were curious about, or was it more from like, you know, kind of a feminist angle? Or I'm just wondering kind of where you got started.
Yeah, I think my interest was first peaked to do a project like this when I was doing some research on World War I a number of years back in 2017 for the 100th anniversary. And I found some of these old propaganda posters, and, you know, they had like a Lady Liberty stepping on a saloon owner or on a bottle of booze saying like non-essential. And there was really just so much of this propaganda that was anti-alcohol, that was often anti-German, and a lot of the same images were being used to push for women's suffrage as well. And so I came to it knowing that the mainstream movements were going to have shortcomings. I should say that there were a ton of incredible women across races who were advocating both for temperance and for suffrage. I call attention to specific people within the documentary who were kind of unyielding in their progressivism, and also some who were a little bit more yielding and used some of these arguments. Not everybody in these movements was deploying these arguments, but a lot of people, especially in the mainstream movement, were. So I came to it kind of knowing that there were these shortcomings. And so I knew it was a complicated movement. And I wanted to understand how individual women experienced that and how they interacted with these movements and kind of who got to. And I think also I'm always curious, whether in women's history or in history generally, about the sort of tightrope that people and women have to walk, especially for women who are kind of on the bleeding edge of certain movements. I'm always interested in learning when people have been unyielding and uncompromising in that progressivism, and also when activists of relative privilege have been willing to limit the progressive potential of their movements in exchange for sort of self-beneficial political efficiency. And I think that's something that we can look at throughout history and still in our current moment. So I wanted to add to the narrative of the 100th anniversary of suffrage and temperance by, in the documentary, calling attention to people who were doing interesting work, but also complicating some of the mainstream movement, what was happening in the mainstream movement.
That's fascinating. I love it because, you know, once you see that kind of that switch, because like the World War I is such an instigating time for a lot of different things, and so that really makes sense. That kind of would be that kind of the initial seed, and then going from there. And also, it really serves the purpose of reminding us that everything is always worth looking at again. You know what I mean? There's never like, okay, we're done with history. The book's been written, and now we move on. No, I mean, there's always a reason to have a fresh perspective and kind of, you know, go over something again. So I really appreciate the answer. Can you tell me a little bit more about what your Gale Family Library experience was like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've done a lot of research at the Gale Family Library. I think it's an amazing resource. It's open to the public, and a lot of really great digitized collections, which is really important, especially now during COVID. And when you can get into the physical collections as well, I mean, just an absolute treasure trove. I mean, before this project even, there have been countless times when I've been looking through a finding aid or looking through a box, and I just get distracted for like hours at a time because there's always something interesting to pursue.
That's called the rabbit hole.
That is called the rabbit hole, and it is a wonderful place to be. And the Gale Library is a great place to be for it. I mean, there are really so many resources. I mean, we were just talking before this event began about some resources that I didn't know that I like cannot wait to check out, which I know you all are talking about in an upcoming event, from my understanding.
Yeah.
But the Gale Library has a lot of incredible primary and secondary sources. There were a couple of books that I used, a handful of which were put out by the Minnesota Historical Society Press. Mm-hmm. And then the library also has great digitized records of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association and also of the local, or the statewide Women's Christian Temperance Union chapter, which was the largest anti-alcohol group. And there are fantastic newsletters from those organizations, lists of members, texts of speeches. And that's where I was really seeing how this rhetoric was being used through the text of those speeches and really kind of digging deep into that. And there's also the oral history collection, which is just an absolute boon.
Yeah, well, that's great. So how did COVID affect your work? I'm afraid to ask, but in this time, we've got to.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, it did affect the work. There were things that I wasn't able to have access to. I was doing my work starting in the early part of this year, this calendar year, which was when a lot of my research was taking place. So I got a little bit of time in the library, which was fantastic. Mm-hmm. And then had to move into working from home. And honestly, the amount of material that the History Center has digitized and the amount of national resources as well made it so that I felt I could do a really thorough job, even working from home. There's so much that didn't make the documentary that I was able to learn about, and making those decisions of what to cut is just the absolute worst. But even without access to the physical library, there were so many great digitized resources, which is why I really encourage anybody who's interested in doing historical research, you do not have to wait until the end of COVID. In fact, this is probably the best time to do it for our own political education, but also because a lot of us kind of probably have time on our hands.
Well, I do appreciate that very much, because, we really want to, the library really wants people to understand that, yes, we're a physical place, and, we love it when people come to see us, but also that the library and our collections and our content is bigger than that. You know what I mean? Yeah. And you can get to a lot of it digitally, and you can get to a lot of it through the newspapers and things like that. And it's something we're working on expanding all the time. And also, as a side note, I just want to mention that the library has been closed because of COVID for a long time, but we will very slowly be transitioning to appointments. So just keep an eye on the library page for the future of that. So I also want to remind people, just because we're at about the halfway point, please keep sending your questions if you have any for Katie about her project or the research she did or anything like that. But I've got a couple more, so I'll keep going for a bit. I wonder, when was it channel? I mean, I think what I'm hearing you say is that, finding some of the rhetoric and some of the more disturbing parts of the movement of people who were left out, that was kind of not easier to find, but it was kind of more there. Once you found it, you could see it. Mm. How do you find the hidden narrative, the people who are left out? That's always a difficulty, I think, in we know that this is missing, but how do we show the missing, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely it does. I mean, this is something that I really came up against in the research. Certainly. I mean, their archives generally are pretty sparse when it comes to histories of women, especially when it comes to histories of women who were outside the sort of privileged class. And you're right, I was able to find the text of the speeches, and disturbing as it was, I was able to learn pretty concretely what the arguments were that were being made. The harder part was kind of piecing together the story, particularly of Rosa Clinton. So Nettie Hayes has the absolutely fantastic oral history. But with Rosa Clinton, it was really kind of a matter of reading between the lines and using some imagination and asking, if you heard the documentary, also asking the listeners to use some imagination as well. So I was able to use things like city directories to locate where her business was versus where her home was, and look at transportation maps of the time and figure out, well, she could have taken the streetcar there, but perhaps she walked. And, what were sort of the more acceptable roles for women to be doing when they were in a managerial role at a bar like this, where they've been doing janitorial work. And so in the documentary, I kind of asked the listeners to come along and say, maybe she walked, maybe she took the streetcar, things like that. And I think just using images, using postcards like the one that we saw of 6th Street, and just using sort of context clues to piece together what this history might have been.
I think that's so hugely important, though. Like, you're triangulating, it's like you can't actually see it specifically, but you can see the things around it. Yeah. One of my favorite biographies is kind of off subject just for a minute, but that was about Cleopatra, and the author was so great because she really acknowledged, she's like, I can't say this for certain because I didn't find it, but this is what I can tell you other people are doing. You know what I mean? So, but also I think it really brings the listener or reader or whatever into the world when you're asking us to help participate and do that work. It makes it stay in the mind so much more than just being told she was an owner. You know what I mean? When you have to put that little bit of work into it. I love it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's never not disclosed, right? Like,
no, right. No, that's so important.
This is where we're using our imagination, and that in and of itself is telling, isn't it? Because that means that there is a gap in the archive.
Yep. Yeah. So, okay. Well, so can you? This is not a rhetorical question. I really am genuinely interested, though. Why is the story so important today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, there was the obvious 100-year anniversary tie-in, but I think that this story is so much more important than that. I think that I've seen a lot of great work that is both celebrating the amazing victory that the 19th Amendment was, while also complicating it with the fact that this was a movement this was a right that was largely extended primarily to white women for years and years and decades and decades. I've seen a lot of great work that is sort of complicating that. And I hope that my work can sort of complicate some of the narratives as well and tease out where those complications were coming from. I think we have seen this year record turnout in terms of voting and participation in the political process. We know that voting is more important than ever. We have also seen that there are many, many, many ways to seek empowerment, to empower oneself, and to get politically involved, all of which are valid and necessary and come out of people's experience and needs and demands. And we have seen that this year, and I think we see it in history as well, and just validating these different means of pursuing empowerment.
I love the answer. Thank you very much for that. That's great. Okay, so who would you most like to get a drink with from the podcast or the documentary?
I mean, I think it probably just has to be Nettie. I mean,
it's kind of yeah. I mean, I always want to ask that. Like, Rosa would be nice, but yeah, Nettie, she seems so great.
It's like, and I've listened to her voice now so much. I feel like I know her, and so it's almost easy to imagine getting a drink with her, which is just amazing that she shared in her life so willingly, and such a great oral history. And at the same time, I think I would love to get a drink with Rosa as well, because as we just talked about, there is gaps in the archives. I don't really know very much about what Rosa's life was like, and I would love to know.
I also am interested though in the lady from the very, very first picture of the billiard hall with the water, because I wish to see the after picture. You know what I mean? Did she actually dump it, or was she just threatening you? Like, what happened?
Yeah, I almost feel so. I found that image in the Women's Christian Temperance Union's book about their own organization. Yeah. And I can only imagine that if they snapped this picture as a way to say, like, look at the mistrust and the disgust that we face, that they would have snapped a picture of it after the fact as well. Although then again, it's like photography was a different tool then, wasn't it? So maybe it wasn't so easy to just take another picture. Yeah, I would absolutely love to know. And I wasn't able to find out too much about too many of these specific women, but some of them did go on to take on leadership roles in the WCTU. And interestingly, not to get too sidetracked because this is a whole nother story almost, but a lot of the same women who were advocating for prohibition shortly before it was passed, a lot of them went on to actually advocate to overturn prohibition. And it's interesting because they used sort of the same arguments of the protection of the family and the home. So it wasn't like they had a big political change of heart and said, we don't support controlling the substance in this way. It was more like, we wanted prohibition because we thought that it would keep our families intact, keep our children safe. But it turns out that prohibition actually leads to a lot of widespread organized crime, and our children are criminalized just for wanting to drink, and our husbands are criminalized for wanting to drink. And in order to protect the home, now we actually need to overturn it.
Be careful what you wish for is right.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there's some amazing women who led that movement too. I just wrote an article, came out last week with National Geographic, about some of the women who did that work. So we could drop that in the comments as well.
Okay, yeah, great. Oh, thank you so much. I can't wait to look that up. So that's awesome. Okay, so my last question before we get to audience questions is, what advice do you have to give to somebody who might want to start a research project of any sort?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think just starting is the best thing I can say. Sometimes I know I have so many different interests that I think if I didn't just know that I was going to come back to some of the story topics that I want to do, I would just be paralyzed with kind of the there's just like too many options of things that are intriguing. So know that by picking one topic, you're never going to research all the other topics. I have like a running spreadsheet of every project I hope to do. And really just get started. Between the Historical Society and other national resources, the Library of Congress has a lot of great things digitized. There is so many ways to do that research from home. And just go for it. I think be ready to have your mind changed. Be ready to go down some rabbit holes that you don't necessarily anticipate going down, because often that's sort of where the most interesting material lies, is kind of at the far reaches of what you thought you might learn, what you thought you might find.
Well, and also it's an opportunity to kind of change course entirely. You know what I mean? That's some of the best things I've ever found. It's like I just get rid of the old topic, and now because I found this one.
Totally, you have to be flexible.
Yeah, no, that's really great. So yeah, thank you for that. Also, I just want to mention again though about this documentary. Like it's such like. Had your story here been an article, it still would have been great, but just like the listening to it, it was a different format than I would have expected. You know what I mean? Because I wouldn't have thought of it, but I love it, and it just works so well. So I think that's another thing for people, is that you can think about lots of different ways to get this out. It doesn't have to be an article. It doesn't have to be a book necessarily. There are ways, you can make a digital slideshow. I don't know, but anyway, just
so, and do the medium that you enjoy listening to or consuming in some way, because if you're consuming historical media, whatever format you consume it in is probably the one you're going to be most versed in, and then you'll be able to sort of draw inspiration from different creators and different historians to create your own story.
That makes sense. Okay, well, I think we're ready to answer some questions now. So if you'd like to give us some, that'd be great. Okay, so Lizzie Schmidt says, how are women of color treated in this movement?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's sort of the two movements that we are talking about, temperance and suffrage. I think that in both of these movements, there were women of color and in particular Indigenous women and Black women who were major advocates for both temperance and for suffrage. They're not necessarily the women who we hold up as heroes of these movements, but absolutely these women were involved. One of the stories that I think is most telling about how white women treated, in particular Black women, in these movements, in the temperance movement, for example, and in the suffrage movement as well. Originally, the suffrage movement was very multiracial, but after there was universal male suffrage, which at least in theory gave Black men the right to vote, you saw a very, very significant shift among the white women in the suffrage movement. They became, in the words of one of the interviewees in the documentary, quite virulently racist in the aftermath of that law. And you saw this shift from sort of an eagerness to work across race lines to white women really being willing to sacrifice the support and sacrifice the solidarity of women across races and of women across classes. I think the temperance movement didn't even necessarily have that initial cooperation, and a lot of the temperance work that was happening within, in particular, the Black community was happening within the Black church, and it was very, very effective. But those are women who were not necessarily engaged by the white women who were, quote unquote, leading this movement. Yeah, and you see that in the aftermath of suffrage in particular as well. I mean, it takes years and decades before the Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965. And so this wasn't just something that, was a quote unquote politically expedient trade-off for white women in the moment. It was something that had an impact for decades and decades and still has an impact. There's still a lot of barriers to voting. Similarly, a lot of our talk about controlled substances is not just about controlling substances, it's about controlling people. And I think the documentary shows, and my research shows, that controlling alcohol was about controlling any variety of people who were not wealthy WASPs. It was about controlling indigenous people, it was about controlling working class people. And you see a lot of parallels that are quite frightening.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for that question.
Dr. Eder would like to know, so much organization and leadership as part of the temperance movement, was that energy transferred to other work or causes after Prohibition? Yeah, there were, like you just said.
Yeah, so it's almost, I don't mean to laugh, I apologize, but these women just absolutely had their work cut out for them after Prohibition was passed, because nobody was going to just stop drinking. And it was like they were absolutely fighting an uphill battle. And so the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, really, really, really had a lot to do during Prohibition, because all of a sudden, not only were people drinking, it was also illegal. And since they weren't allowed to drink publicly and with the support of, in a sort of supported economy, there was a whole underground economy that emerged. And so then they had to take on all of this organized crime. And it was really just a losing battle for the leaders of the temperance movement, which is why a lot of them, as I kind of alluded to earlier, ended up shifting over to the anti-prohibition side. But a lot of suffragists did continue to morph their campaigns. A lot of women who were active in the suffrage movement did go on to, say, like, fight child labor, for example, or to run for office themselves. Nellie Francis, who was a Black suffragist from Minnesota, her suffrage club morphed into the Every Woman Progressive Council, and she did profound anti-lynching work. And so certainly there were political skills that were learned in this movement that were carried on after both of these amendments went into effect.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you for that question, too.
Oh, was the Prohibition temperance movement partisan? This comes to us from Barbara Lindeke.
Yeah, so the Prohibition, it was a relatively partisan movement, especially before Prohibition. Temperance was largely a Republican cause, which at the time was the party of Abraham Lincoln. So there was a lot of people, especially in Minnesota, who were anti-slavery, who were also anti-alcohol. But as we know from studying Minnesota history, we know that just because somebody was anti-slavery does not mean that they were anti-racist. And so those messages were still coming into play. The party alignment of the temperance movement started to morph a little bit during the Depression, which is when kind of everything about Prohibition started to change, because not only was there just crime running rampant, but there was also then the Great Depression, and the government was losing the tax revenue from alcohol sales while also spending a huge amount of money trying hopelessly to enforce Prohibition. And so at that point, you start to get less of a party allegiance to the Republican Party and more of a shift to the Democrats of the late 20s, early 30s.
That's fascinating. I didn't consider that.
Yeah, suffrage was temperance was really sort of aligned with these other social reform movements.
Okay. So Marion Bartikoski, I'm so sorry. Anyway, how did the 1918 influenza epidemic affect the bars, temperance, and suffrage?
Yeah, great question. Honestly, this is a little bit harder to find information about because the 1918 epidemic was not really covered in newspapers, as maybe folks have heard throughout this coverage. There was very like tight-lipped about the epidemic. So you can find relatively little coverage. And I didn't necessarily dive super deep into this, but certainly the epidemic did not stop the movement for suffrage. People were still gathering. Now, thankfully, we have more information about how to gather in a way that mitigates risk than they probably had back then. And in terms of the bars, I don't exactly know, but I would say that there were a lot of bars, especially in Minnesota, that were already closed by the time the epidemic happened, because they had already, Minnesota was a place that had a lot of anti-alcohol sentiment. And so a lot of bars had closed down even before Prohibition, and even kind of on the cusp of when the epidemic would have been coming in.
Well, like you talk about in your second round, though, with the anti-German sentiment becoming so important too. So I'm sure that's another reason a lot of them close. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Really interesting question, though. I would like to dig deeper into that.
Next round.
Right.
Well, are there any other questions out there? Oh, okay. So when you were looking through your primary sources, did you find anything that describes the behavior of those drinking in saloons, something akin to an ethnography of saloons? Ooh, yeah, I do. I like that question, especially because like when you were talking about the people who were, going to protest, but going to hang out first.
Right. You're like, what's going on here? It's a little bit curious. Yeah, I would say that I am not the expert in this, but thankfully the Minnesota Historical Society Press has just put out a great book. I will show you.
Yay!
Yay!
Proud.
That's mine. Here we go. Closing Time by Bill and Dickey and Andy Sturdivant. Andy was interviewed in the documentary, and he really sheds amazing light onto what it would have been like actually in these bars. He used a lot of great primary sources that I was able to see as well, newspapers and things like this, that really described how these places looked. And I think when you can imagine people in their surroundings, and sometimes there's even drawings in the newspapers of the people in the bars, and it's kind of smoky, you can start to sort of get a sense of what the behavior would have been like. And oftentimes, it was often men in bars, but there were also women's bars. Klein and Ponce had a women's bar on site, and that's Rosa Klein's, the bar that she co-owned. And in the documentary, Andy and I talk about the fact that there was a bar on 6th Street, just near Rosa Klein's bar, where there was a headline that said that the Baby Buggy Brigade could no longer be stationed outside the saloon. So basically there was a problem where women were leaving their cradles with their babies outside or in a corner, I believe in a corner of the bar while they would drink at the bar. And it was interesting to me because it was like, the story wasn't that women were in the bar. That was just kind of the subtext. The story was that they were leaving their babies and that they could no longer do that. But to me, it just is like, you do get to read between the lines a little bit to gauge what people's behavior was like, because you could see that, well, if the main story wasn't the fact that women were there in the first place, then women must have been just going there and enjoying themselves.
I think that's absolutely fascinating, considering, you still see signs like that sometimes, like, please don't leave your stroller here or whatever, more for serious issues than like, watch your own kid. Anyway, okay, so I think we maybe have one more question to get to.
Oh, this has gone by.
Richard Henry said, so much information left out that you might do further documentaries. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you, Richard. I did recently put out this article that was about the women who worked to overturn Prohibition. I kind of give them a little bit of the nod in this documentary, but I don't go into their stories. And so it's been amazing to be able to do sort of some offshoot work from this documentary. I also have a slew of projects that I'm working on at any given moment. And so I've been so grateful to be able to do sort of some offshoots of this particular documentary, but I'm also working on wrapping up a couple of big projects, one of them about the Civilian Conservation Corps, part of which is about that experience in Minnesota, and one about the Skyways. So there's sort of a lot of, not only is there a lot of material that didn't make this documentary, there's just a lot of material in my mind all the time that I am trying to get out. Yeah, so hopefully more work on this topic as well.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, we have one last question, last question about Rosa Cline. Apologies, I missed the beginning. Rosa Cline's bar on 6th Street. Could women own property at that time in Minnesota?
So Rosa Clinton was a co-owner of the bar. Her and her husband and I believe her brother co-owned the bar. And so she was not an outright owner. There were, I'm not sure if she would have been legally entitled to own property, but there was a major brewery, I'm going to forget which one, elsewhere in Minnesota and there were actually a couple of smaller breweries and bars as well, where the owner had been the man, the husband, who died, and the woman went on to kind of take over the business. That was relatively common, but I don't know if in that case it would have been, say, in a son's name, for example.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
All right, Ned, last one. Was there a difference between St. Paul and Minneapolis in their attitude toward the temperance movement, outstate versus cities? Ooh, that is a good question.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to get this wrong, so let me rack my brain and kind of go back in that time. St. Paul was kind of founded as like a whiskey trading outpost. And so and Minneapolis was kind of founded as this like haven for Republican, social reformist East Coasters, waspy East Coasters.
Protestants.
And so I think
Protestants versus Catholics.
Right, absolutely. And so I think from the beginning, you kind of had this idea that like Minneapolis didn't want to be what St. Paul was. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, during Prohibition, St. Paul was absolutely a hub for, and Minneapolis was as well, but St. Paul is really what we know as having kind of the hubs of organized crime. And in terms of outstate versus the cities, a lot of people in the countryside were making a living farming the products that ultimately went into making booze, into making liquor. And so a lot of the people who were making liquor on the farm were the people who ended up kind of having the most to gain when Prohibition went into effect, because it was a really lucrative industry, not just in the cities with the clubs, but in the countryside as well.
Fascinating. Katie, I swear, I think we could stay here all day and talk about this stuff. You're such a joy to talk to, and you're so smart and knowledgeable and fun. Anyway, but we are going to have to wrap up for now, I'm afraid. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time to do this, because obviously you're a very busy person. Your project,
thank you.
Stories and insight. It's just great. I want to remind people to where to find the documentary. So if my colleagues behind the scenes could thank you. Good timing. I want to remind people out there to check out the Votes for Women online exhibit that's on mnhs.org right now, and that it will be upcoming exhibit in the History Center soon. Can't remember the dates for that, but I'm sure it's on our homepage. Also, I want to encourage people to take a look at the History at Home page that we have on the website to kind of think about different things that you can do from home, different resources we have available. Since, it looks like we're going to be in our homes again for a while, there's just some stuff to do there. And also keep an eye on the library's page for, as we start to get more access. I want to give a big thank you to the behind the scenes people here who made this run as smoothly as it did. We really appreciate that. I want to thank you out there for watching and joining us and asking such great questions. I really appreciate that. I also want to remind you, please, to take the really quick short survey, if you would. That link will be in the comments. And also just be, gentle, since we haven't done this much before. But anyway, no, it was really great and fun, and I appreciate everybody being here. So we'll talk about future projects, Katie, no doubt.
I hope so. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks for listening. Thanks to the Historical Society and KFAI for supporting this project as well. It was a dream come true for me.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So thanks. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.